Arrival shock in America. Have you ever stood in a place where everyone speaks a language you've studied for years, yet your mind suddenly goes blank, as if someone quietly unplugged it? That was me during my first week in the United States. And I learned very fast that the problem wasn't just English. It was how life works here. How people think. How you survive emotionally in a completely new system. On my first day, I walked out of the airport wearing a light jacket. The weather report said mild. On paper, that sounded friendly. In real life, the air felt sharp, dry, and unfamiliar. American weather doesn't just touch your skin. It sneaks into your mood. Your brain is suddenly juggling temperature, time zones, new routines, and non-stop English everywhere. On signs. On loudspeakers. In small talk that passes before your brain even finishes loading the meaning. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. You can know English, and still not be able to live in English. In class, your brain has time. In real life, no one waits. Conversations move fast, polite, efficient, and emotionally distant. When someone says, "How are you?" they are not asking about your struggles. It's a social handshake, not an invitation. If you answer honestly, people may smile and step back slightly. Psychologically, it does something strange to you. You're not stupid. You're not unprepared. But you suddenly feel smaller. Scientists call this culture shock. Your brain is overloaded with novelty, so it switches to energy-saving mode. Less talking. More silence. And silence, when it lasts too long, quietly eats your confidence. You start avoiding conversations. You hear English every day, but it doesn't really sink in. You read, but nothing sticks. You speak, but your voice gets softer, as if you're afraid of disturbing the air. I remember one morning at a coffee shop. The barista asked quickly, "For here or to go?" A simple question. I had learned it before. But in that moment, my brain froze. Heart racing. Dry mouth. I answered wrong. It was a tiny mistake. But it followed me for hours, replaying in my head. That feeling, that you don't quite belong, maybe you know it too. Neuroscience explains this better than motivation quotes ever could. In a new environment, your sympathetic nervous system is more active. Your brain prioritizes survival, not learning. In simple terms, your brain is trying to keep you safe, not fluent. So if you feel frustrated while practicing listening, reading, or speaking English, the issue may not be your effort. It may be your nervous system. During my first week in America, I barely learned any new vocabulary. But I observed everything. I noticed how Americans say no very softly. I'm not sure. Maybe another time. No long explanations. No guilt. At that moment, I didn't fully understand it, but my brain recorded it. This is a culture where personal boundaries matter more than pleasing words. That insight slowly changed how I approached English. I realized something important. If you don't protect your energy, English becomes pressure instead of a tool. I used to force myself to listen to fast podcasts, watch difficult news, speak like a native. The result? Exhaustion. frustration, the urge to quit. Meanwhile, I was living inside a gold mine of real, slow, repeated English every single day, if I allowed myself to slow down too. So I shifted my mindset. I stopped trying to improve fast. I focused on understanding enough to live. I listened to simple phrases. Take your time. No rush. I read signs. I spoke short, clear sentences. And I allowed silence when needed. Ironically, that's when my listening improved. When pressure dropped, learning increased. This isn't inspiration, it's biology. If you're feeling tired of English right now, remember this: you're not lazy, your brain is overloaded. My story in America didn't start with confidence or success. It started with shock. And that shock taught me something essential. To learn English sustainably, you first have to treat yourself gently inside a new world. Basically, I didn't fail in my first week in America. I was just learning how to breathe again, in another language. Weather changed my mood. Nobody warns you that weather can change the way your brain learns a language. They tell you to buy a better jacket, drink more water, check the forecast. But no one says this. Climate can quietly rewrite your emotions, and emotions decide whether English enters your head or bounces right back out. My second week in America began with gray skies. Not dramatic rain. Not storms. Just long, flat, colorless days. The kind where the sun technically exists, but you don't feel invited. Back home, weather was loud. Heat, humidity, sudden rain. It forced you to react. Here, the weather felt distant, controlled, predictable, and somehow, lonely. I woke up one morning and felt heavy for no clear reason. Nothing bad had happened. But my body moved slower. My thoughts felt thicker. I sat at the table with my notebook, opened an English text, and realized I couldn't focus at all. The words were there. My eyes were working. My brain just didn't care. This wasn't laziness. It was biology. Cold and low sunlight affect serotonin and dopamine levels. That's not motivational talk, that's neuroscience. When daylight drops, your brain produces fewer chemicals responsible for motivation and emotional balance. In simple terms, less sun, less mental energy. And when mental energy is low, language learning becomes harder. Even if you're doing everything right. I noticed how Americans adapted to this climate. They didn't fight it emotionally. They planned around it. Coffee became a ritual, not a habit. Indoor spaces were warm, controlled, emotionally neutral. Conversations stayed light. Nobody complained much about the weather. It was just something you worked around, not something you felt deeply. That was different for me. I carried the weather inside my body. One afternoon, I went for a walk just to hear English around me. I wasn't planning to talk. Just listen. Footsteps. Cars. Short conversations passing by. Stay warm. Crazy cold today. Simple phrases. Repeated. Predictable. And slowly, something softened. My brain didn't need to translate. It just recognized. That's when I understood something important. listening works better when your body is calm. You don't absorb language through effort alone. You absorb it through presence. But here's where things get tricky. When your mood drops, your inner voice changes. Mine became quieter, more critical. You should be better by now. Others learn faster. Why are you still struggling? That voice doesn't motivate. It drains. And the more drained you feel, the less you want to speak. I started avoiding interactions. Not consciously. Just subtly. Shorter answers. Fewer questions. More nodding. On the surface, everything looked fine. Inside, my English world was shrinking. Psychologists call this withdrawal behavior. When the brain senses prolonged discomfort, it reduces exposure. Less risk. Less stimulation. Less growth. The problem is, language needs gentle exposure to survive. So I made a small change. Not a dramatic one. I adjusted my environment instead of blaming myself. I studied English near windows. I walked before listening practice. I chose audio that matched my energy, slow voices, calm stories, familiar vocabulary. I stopped forcing myself to sound enthusiastic. I allowed neutral. And something unexpected happened. My comprehension improved. Not because the material was easier, but because my emotional state finally matched the pace of learning. Weather also changed how people communicated. In colder regions, conversations were shorter. Less emotional display. More efficiency. That doesn't mean people were cold, it means warmth was saved for private spaces. If you don't understand that, you might mistake distance for rejection. I remember a moment when someone declined an invitation with a simple, "I'll pass this time." No explanation. No apology. My old self would have overthought that sentence for days. In this climate, both physical and emotional, clarity mattered more than comfort. That realization connected something in my mind. If the environment values clarity over emotional overflow, then simple English isn't weak English, it's powerful English. I stopped trying to decorate my sentences. I stopped apologizing for pauses. I spoke in clean lines. Subject. Verb. Meaning. My brain felt less pressure. My mood stabilized. Learning became sustainable. If you're practicing English and suddenly feel unmotivated, ask yourself this. Is it really about discipline? Or is your environment quietly working against you? Your brain isn't a machine. It reacts to light, temperature, rhythm, and safety. Language lives inside that system. When the system is stressed, learning slows down. That week taught me that progress doesn't always look like excitement. Sometimes it looks like stability. Like showing up calmly. Like letting the weather be what it is, without turning it into a personal failure. English didn't improve because I pushed harder. It improved because I finally listened. Not just to the language, but to my own internal climate. Culture of saying yes. At some point in America, you realize you're not tired because you work too much. You're tired because you say yes too often, especially in a language that isn't yours yet. And nobody tells you this at the beginning. They teach you vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, but they don't teach you the most exhausting word in English, yes. My third week in the US was the week my energy started leaking out quietly. Nothing dramatic happened. No big conflict. No argument. Just a long series of small yes moments. Sure. That's fine. I can do that. Words that sounded polite, harmless, even friendly. But inside my body, each one cost something. American culture is interesting this way. On the surface, it values independence and boundaries. But in daily life, there's also an unspoken expectation to be agreeable, cooperative, easy to work with. Especially if you're new. Especially if you speak with an accent. You don't want to be difficult. You don't want to be misunderstood. So you say yes before your brain fully checks in. That was me. I said yes when conversations moved too fast. Yes when I didn't fully understand instructions. Yes when someone asked a favor and my body was already tired. I told myself I was being flexible, open-minded, grateful. But my nervous system knew the truth. It was overwhelmed. Psychologically, this makes sense. When you're in a new culture, your brain looks for safety. And one shortcut to safety is agreement. Saying yes reduces immediate conflict. It buys social approval. It keeps things smooth. The problem is, smooth on the outside doesn't mean calm on the inside. Every unnecessary yes added noise to my English learning. Because when you agree without understanding, your brain goes into repair mode afterward. It replays conversations. It fills gaps with anxiety. It worries about consequences. And anxiety is loud. It blocks listening. It ruins focus. I noticed something else. Native speakers around me didn't explain much when they said no. They didn't soften it with stories. They didn't apologize excessively. I can't today. That doesn't work. For me. Short. Clear. And then they moved on. No tension. No drama. That contrast was uncomfortable. Back where I grew up, saying no often came with guilt. You had to justify it. Protect other people's feelings. In America, no was often just information. A boundary. A scheduling fact. And realizing that made me rethink how I was using English. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Overusing yes slows down your language progress. Not because yes is bad, but because it pushes you into situations your brain isn't ready to process. You hear too much, too fast. You agree to things you don't fully understand. And then you associate English with stress. I remember one specific moment. Someone explained a process to me, fast, detailed, full of assumptions. I understood maybe 60%. At the end, they asked, "Does that make sense?" My mouth said yes. My body said no. My brain panicked later. That night, I couldn't focus on anything. Not listening practice. Not reading. My head felt noisy. That's when I connected the dots. The problem wasn't my listening skill. It was my lack of boundaries. From a neuroscience perspective, this matters. When you say yes under pressure, your brain activates threat monitoring. Cortisol increases. Memory formation decreases. In simple terms, your brain is busy protecting you, not learning. Language learning needs safety, not politeness at any cost. So I experimented with something scary. I started saying no, but softly. Simply. In very basic English. I'm not sure. Can you repeat that? I need a moment. At first, my voice felt strange saying those sentences. My accent felt louder. My pauses felt longer. But something surprising happened. People didn't get angry. Nobody rejected me. In fact, conversations slowed down, clarified, became easier, and my listening improved. Because when you allow yourself to say no, or not yet, you give your brain time. Time to process. Time to breathe. Time to actually hear the language instead of surviving it. There's also a cultural layer here that matters for learners. In American communication, clarity is often more respectful than overagreement. Saying yes and failing to follow through is worse than saying no early. Once I understood that, my relationship with English shifted. It stopped being a performance. It became a tool. I stopped chasing approval through fluency. I focused on honesty through simplicity. That week, my English didn't suddenly become advanced. But it became stable. And stability is underrated. Stable learning doesn't burn you out. It compounds quietly. If you're practicing English and feel constantly tired, ask yourself this question gently. How many yeses did you give today that your body didn't agree with? You don't need complex sentences to protect yourself. You need permission. Permission to pause. To clarify. To decline. And English, simple English, is enough for that. That was the week I learned something essential. Fluency doesn't start with saying more. Sometimes, it starts with learning how to say no. And meaning it. English fear in daily life. Fear doesn't always show up as panic. Sometimes it shows up as politeness. As silence. As a small smile while your brain is screaming. Please don't ask me another question. By the fourth week in America, I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't afraid of English itself. I was afraid of using English in real life. Where mistakes don't disappear after class ends. Daily life is where English becomes sharp. In lessons, you control the speed. You can pause. Rewind. Guess. In real life, English shows up while you're holding groceries, filling out forms, answering unexpected questions, or standing in line with people behind you. There's no excuse me, I need a second to remember the verb tense. Life keeps moving. And your brain feels that pressure immediately. I noticed it in my body first. My shoulders tightened when someone approached. My breathing got shallow when I heard rapid speech. My ears were technically hearing English, but my brain filtered half of it out. This is called auditory narrowing. Under stress, the brain limits incoming information to reduce overload. Helpful for survival. Terrible for language learning. And the worst part. The fear was invisible. From the outside, I looked fine. Functioning. Smiling. Nodding. But inside, every interaction felt like walking across a thin bridge made of unfamiliar words. One wrong step, and I imagined falling into embarrassment. The fear wasn't about grammar. It was about consequences. What if I misunderstand and agree to something I can't do? What if I respond wrong and sound rude? What if they repeat the question, and I still don't get it? That mental noise made English feel dangerous. And when something feels dangerous, your brain avoids it, even if you want to improve. There was a moment in a grocery store that clarified everything. An employee asked me a question about a product. I caught maybe half the words. I guessed the meaning. I answered confidently and incorrectly. Nothing terrible happened. They corrected me kindly. The interaction lasted less than a minute. But my brain reacted as if I had narrowly escaped a disaster. That reaction wasn't logical. It was neurological. When your brain associates language with threat, it strengthens avoidance patterns. You don't stop learning because you're lazy. You stop learning because your nervous system is trying to protect you from perceived harm. Here's the irony. The more you avoid daily English, the scarier it becomes. And the scarier it becomes, the more mistakes feel catastrophic. It's a feedback loop. Fear feeds silence. Silence feeds fear. I had to interrupt that loop gently. Not with confidence tricks. Not with positive affirmations. But with controlled exposure. I chose low-risk interactions. Short ones. Predictable ones. Ordering food. Asking for directions I didn't really need. Repeating the same phrases. My goal wasn't to sound natural. It was to let my nervous system experience English without punishment. And something important happened. My fear didn't disappear. It softened. Psychology explains this through habituation. When the brain experiences a feared stimulus repeatedly without negative consequences, it recalibrates. The stimulus becomes neutral. Daily English stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like background noise. Another shift mattered even more. I stopped pretending I understood when I didn't. That habit, pretend understanding, is extremely common among language learners. It feels polite, efficient, but it's dangerous. Because your brain learns that confusion must be hidden, not resolved. And hidden confusion turns into anxiety. So I practiced saying very simple sentences. Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't catch that. Can you speak a little slower? These sentences felt vulnerable. They exposed my limits. But they also slowed the world down. People adjusted. Conversations became clearer. And my brain relaxed. When fear dropped, listening improved automatically. There's a scientific reason for this. Comprehension requires working memory. Anxiety consumes that memory. When fear decreases, memory becomes available again. English didn't become easier. My brain became more available. I also noticed something cultural. Americans are used to clarification. Meetings, customer service, daily interactions, all full of repetition and confirmation. Asking for clarification wasn't weakness. It was normal. I had imported my fear from somewhere else. That realization lifted a quiet weight. Daily life English stopped being about proving myself. It became about functioning. Getting through the day. Solving small problems. And those small successes added up. Not dramatically. Quietly. If you're afraid of using English in real situations, this matters. Fear doesn't mean you're bad at English. It means your brain is treating English like a risk. And brains can relearn safety. You don't need bravery. You need predictability. Repetition. Simple language. Permission to ask again. That week, English stopped being an enemy hiding in daily life. It became something else. A little uncomfortable. A little imperfect. But no longer scary. Enough to avoid. And that changed everything. Love across cultures. Love sounds universal until you try to live inside it using a second language. Then suddenly, love becomes vocabulary. Tone. Timing. Silence. By the fifth part of my time in America, I learned this the hard way. Romantic feelings don't protect you from cultural misunderstandings. Sometimes, they amplify them. I didn't come to America looking for a love story. I came with practical goals. Work. Language. Survival. Love showed up quietly, without asking permission, and immediately started testing my English in places textbooks never reach. At first, everything felt simple. Shared laughter. Curiosity. That warm feeling of being seen. But very quickly, differences appeared, not dramatic ones, just small mismatches that slowly created tension. How often to text? How directly to speak? How much explanation a feeling requires? In my culture, love often means reading between the lines. In America, love prefers clear sentences. And clarity is hard when English is still heavy in your mouth. I noticed how often I softened my words. How I avoided saying what I actually felt, because I didn't know how to say it cleanly in English. I used long explanations instead of simple truths. I said maybe when I meant no. I said it's okay when it wasn't. I thought I was protecting the relationship. In reality, I was confusing it. There's a psychological reason for this. When language feels limited, people overcompensate emotionally. You explain more. You apologize more. You assume more responsibility. And love becomes exhausting, not because it's difficult, but because communication is inefficient. One evening, a small disagreement turned bigger than it needed to be. Not because of the topic, but because of misunderstanding. I felt unheard. The other person felt confused. English failed both of us, not as a language, but as a tool we didn't know how to use properly yet. That night, something clicked. Love doesn't need complex English. It needs honest English. In American culture, emotional responsibility is often individual. You're expected to say what you need. Clearly. Without hints. Without emotional puzzles. Silence isn't depth, it's absence of information. And once I understood that, many things made sense. I started listening differently. Not just to words, but to expectations behind them. When someone said, "I need space," it wasn't rejection. It was maintenance. When they asked directly, it wasn't aggression. It was efficiency. Love here wasn't colder, it was structured. I also realized how fear affected my listening. When emotions were involved, my brain reacted faster. Heart rate up. Defenses on. Comprehension down. That's biology again. Emotional stress narrows attention. You hear tone before meaning. And if your English isn't stable yet, misunderstandings multiply. So I slowed everything down. I practiced saying simple emotional sentences. Very simple. I feel uncomfortable. I need time to think. I don't understand this part. At first, these sentences felt blunt. Almost rude. But they worked. They reduced guessing. Reduced tension. Reduced emotional noise. And something unexpected happened, intimacy increased. Because clarity builds trust. This mattered for language learning too. When emotional pressure dropped, my listening improved. I could actually hear full sentences, instead of just emotional signals. My reading comprehension felt lighter. Speaking felt less like walking on glass. Love became a classroom, but not the painful kind. There's also a cultural misunderstanding many learners face. In America, directness is often seen as respect. You respect someone enough to be clear. Indirectness can feel like avoidance. Once I saw that, I stopped blaming myself for not being emotional enough or too emotional. I was just translating values across languages. That translation takes practice. And here's the part people rarely say out loud. Learning English through love is intense. Emotions magnify every mistake. A wrong word can feel like a wrong feeling. But it's also powerful. Because emotions make language stick. You remember sentences tied to real moments. I remembered phrases not from textbooks, but from real conversations. Real tension. Real repair. Those words stayed. Love also forced me to confront boundaries again. Saying yes when I meant no created emotional debt. Saying no, kindly, clearly, created stability. And stability made love safer. By the end of that week, I wasn't suddenly fluent. But I was more honest. And honesty simplified my English. Less decoration. More meaning. If you're learning English and navigating relationships, romantic or not, remember this. You don't need perfect sentences to express real feelings. You need simple words used at the right moment. Love doesn't ask for advanced grammar. It asks for courage, clarity, and the willingness to speak slowly, even when your heart is fast. Marriage stress test. Marriage doesn't break people. Pressure does. And when pressure shows up in a second language, it doesn't knock politely, it rearranges the furniture in your head. By the sixth part of my journey in America, I learned something uncomfortable. Marriage becomes a language test long before it becomes an emotional one. In movies, love solves everything. In real life, love fills out forms. Suddenly, conversations weren't just about feelings. They were about insurance, schedules, responsibilities, expectations, and decisions that needed to be made. Now, in English, without subtitles, without timeouts, and when you're married, or building a life with someone, misunderstanding isn't just awkward. It's expensive. Emotionally and sometimes literally. I noticed how quickly English drained me during serious conversations. My brain worked twice as hard. Once to understand the words. Once to manage the emotions attached to them. That double load created fatigue I didn't know how to explain. So I didn't. I stayed quiet. Or worse, I agreed just to end the conversation. That's where trouble starts. Marriage in America values communication. But not in the poetic way. It values clarity. Who does what? When? Why? And how long? Vague answers feel unsafe. Emotional hints don't translate well. If you grew up in a culture where love means anticipating needs, this feels harsh at first. I remember a small disagreement about something ordinary: time, schedules, commitments. The words weren't aggressive, but the pace was fast. I felt cornered, not by the person, but by the language. My listening narrowed. My responses became shorter. My body reacted before my brain finished processing. That's a classic stress response. Under emotional pressure, the brain's language center competes with the threat detection system. Guess which one wins? So instead of communicating, I withdrew. I told myself I was being patient, understanding, flexible. But patience without expression turns into resentment. And resentment doesn't care how good your grammar is. That week, I realized something important: marriage doesn't require advanced English, it requires regulated English. English spoken when your nervous system is calm enough to listen and respond honestly. The breakthrough didn't come from learning new words. It came from changing when and how I spoke. I stopped trying to resolve things immediately. I asked for time. Simple sentences again. Can we talk later? I need time to think. I feel overwhelmed right now. Those sentences felt risky. Like I was delaying responsibility. But the opposite happened. Conversations improved. Because timing matters more than fluency. I also learned that American marital culture often separates emotion from logistics. You don't need to sound emotional to be caring. You need to be clear. Saying, "I'm not ready to decide today," was more respectful than forcing a yes I couldn't support later. There's psychology behind this. When people feel heard and informed, conflict decreases. When communication is delayed but intentional, trust increases. Silence without explanation creates anxiety. Silence with context creates safety. That distinction changed everything. English stopped being the enemy inside my marriage. It became a shared tool. Imperfect, but usable. And my partner adjusted too. Speech slowed. Questions became clearer. We met in the middle, not linguistically, but emotionally. This also changed how I practiced English. I started rehearsing real-life sentences instead of abstract ones. Not advanced phrases, but functional truth. I don't agree. I need help with this. I'm not comfortable. These sentences aren't romantic. They are protective. And protection is essential for love to survive pressure. I noticed something else. When I stopped over-explaining, conversations shortened. Emotional energy returned. Less talking. More understanding. English became lighter. Marriage stress didn't disappear. But it stopped feeling like a constant exam. It became a shared problem-solving process. And that made language learning sustainable. If you're learning English while navigating marriage or long-term relationships, this matters deeply. Language gaps don't ruin relationships. Unspoken pressure does. And pressure grows fastest when you try to be perfect instead of honest. You don't need to win arguments in English. You need to stay present. Calm enough to listen. Brave enough to pause. Clear enough to say no when needed. That week taught me this. Marriage isn't about speaking beautifully. It's about speaking truthfully. Even when the words are simple. And the accent is still there. Learning no the hard way. There's a specific moment when being polite turns into self-betrayal. It doesn't come with drama. It comes quietly, wearing good intentions. For me, that moment arrived when I said yes one too many times in America, and paid for it in ways I didn't expect. This was the week I learned no the hard way. The situation itself wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary. A request. A favor. Something that sounded reasonable on the surface. I understood most of the words. Not all the implications. My body felt tired, but my mouth said yes before my brain finished checking in. Again. That yes created a chain reaction. More expectations. More follow-ups. More explanations. Each one required English. Fast English. Emotional English. And suddenly, I was stuck managing a situation I never fully agreed to, using a language that still demanded a lot of energy. This is where language learning gets dangerous. Not academically dangerous, emotionally dangerous. Because when you agree without clarity, you don't just misunderstand words. You misunderstand responsibility. I spent days feeling irritated without knowing why. My motivation dropped. My listening practice felt heavy. Reading felt pointless. English became associated with pressure again. And pressure always shows up in the body before it shows up in logic. I started waking up. Tense. Jaw tight. Shoulders raised. My brain replayed conversations I wished I had handled differently. That replay loop is your nervous system trying to regain control. It's exhausting. Psychology explains this well. When people violate their own boundaries, even unintentionally, the brain reacts with stress. Cortisol levels increase. Focus decreases. Memory suffers. So while I thought I was being cooperative, my brain thought I was under threat. That's when it hit me. My problem wasn't English ability. It was boundary language. I didn't know how to say no in a way that felt safe. In my head, no sounded aggressive, final, risky, especially in English, especially with an accent. I worried about being misunderstood, judged, or labeled difficult. So I avoided it. But avoiding no doesn't remove conflict. It delays it, and makes it heavier. The turning point came after a small, but uncomfortable consequence. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough discomfort to force reflection. I sat with the feeling and asked myself a simple question. What sentence could I have said instead? Not a perfect sentence. A realistic one. I can't do that right now. I need more time. I'm not comfortable with this. Short. Clear. No explanation essay attached. These sentences felt almost too simple. But simplicity is power when your nervous system is overwhelmed. I practiced them out loud. Slowly. Without emotion. Without apology. Just information. The first time I used one in real life, my heart raced. My voice felt louder than usual. My accent felt heavier. But the world didn't collapse. The other person paused. Adjusted. Respected it. That moment rewired something in my brain. Because here's the truth. Most people aren't waiting for you to say yes. They're waiting for clarity. Yes or no. Both are usable. Confusion is not. From a language learning perspective, saying no is incredibly helpful. It slows conversations down. It creates space for clarification. It reduces cognitive load. And when cognitive load drops, learning improves. I noticed immediate changes. My listening got sharper. Because I wasn't bracing for unwanted obligations. My speaking became calmer. My reading focus returned. English stopped feeling like a trap and started feeling like a tool again. There's also a cultural lesson here. In American communication, boundaries are often seen as a form of respect. Saying no early prevents resentment later. Once I understood that, my fear around the word decreased. I also learned to replace automatic yes with neutral pauses. Let me check. I'll think about it. Can I get back to you? These sentences aren't no, but they protect your future no. They give your brain time. Time to process language. Time to check energy. Time to decide consciously. This matters deeply for learners. When you rush agreement, you rush comprehension. And rushed comprehension creates stress that kills motivation. That week, I stopped measuring progress by vocabulary size or pronunciation. I measured it by how safe English felt in my body. And safety increased every time I used language to protect myself instead of please others. If you're learning English and constantly feel tired, ask yourself this gently. How often are you saying yes when you mean maybe, or no? You don't need advanced English to set boundaries. You need a few honest sentences and the courage to use them. And the more you use them, the easier English becomes. That was the week I learned something fundamental. English didn't give me a voice. Learning how to say no did. Simple English, real power. There's a strange moment in language learning when you realize the thing you've been chasing, advanced English, native-like fluency, perfect flow, might be the very thing slowing you down. That moment arrived quietly for me, sometime after I learned how to say no. Once boundaries were in place, something unexpected happened. Simple English started working better than complex English. Not emotionally better. Functionally better. I noticed it first in my body. Conversations felt lighter. My chest didn't tighten as much. My brain didn't rush ahead trying to predict the next sentence. When I spoke simply, my nervous system stayed calmer. And when my nervous system stayed calm, my listening improved automatically. This is the part most people don't talk about. Language isn't just a cognitive skill. It's a regulation skill. The words you choose affect how safe your brain feels. Complex sentences require more working memory, more planning, more self-monitoring. For native speakers, that's fine. For learners under pressure, it's exhausting. I used to believe simple English meant weak English. Childish English. English that made people judge me. But America taught me something different. Simple English is often professional English. Clear. Direct. Efficient. No wasted energy. I watched people around me. In meetings. In stores. In daily life. Native speakers constantly used short sentences. Incomplete sentences. Pauses. Silence. Nobody was performing. They were communicating. That observation changed how I practiced. Instead of memorizing advanced vocabulary, I started mastering basic structures. Subject. Verb. Meaning. I repeated them until they felt automatic. Not elegant, automatic. Because automatic language doesn't drain you. It frees you. There's science behind this. When language production becomes automatic, it moves from conscious processing to procedural memory. That frees up cognitive resources for listening, emotional regulation, and decision-making. In simple terms, simple English gives your brain room to breathe. I tested this in real life. When explaining something, I resisted the urge to decorate my sentences. No extra clauses. No apologies. No softening phrases stacked on top of each other. Just the core message. And people responded better. They asked fewer follow-up questions. They misunderstood me less. They adjusted their speed naturally. My accent didn't disappear, but it stopped being the center of attention. Meaning took over. This also transformed my listening practice. I stopped trying to catch every word. I listened for structure instead. Who is doing what? What is needed? What is next? When you listen for structure, you don't panic when you miss a word. You fill the gap logically. That reduced fear. Fear had been the real enemy all along. Fear of sounding wrong. Fear of being judged. Fear of slowing people down. Simple English lowered that fear because it lowered expectations, both mine and others. I also realized something important about power. In American culture, people who speak clearly are often seen as confident, even if their language is simple. People who over-explain are often seen as unsure. That flipped my old assumptions completely. Simple English didn't make me smaller. It made me steadier. There was a moment when someone asked me a complicated question. Old me would have panicked, tried to answer everything at once, and lost the thread. New me paused and said, "That's a lot. Let me answer one part." Simple sentence. Huge impact. The conversation slowed. Clarified. Became manageable. This matters deeply for learners because complexity feels like progress, but stability is progress. Stable English lets you show up every day without burning out. It lets you practice consistently. And consistency beats intensity every time. I began designing my learning around this idea. Short listening sessions. Familiar topics. Repeated phrases. Real-life sentences. I didn't chase new vocabulary unless I needed it. I chased ease. And ease changed everything. Reading became faster, because I wasn't translating every word. Speaking became calmer, because I wasn't performing. Listening became deeper, because my brain wasn't in fight or flight mode. If you're stuck in English learning, ask yourself this honestly. Are you trying to sound impressive, or trying to function? Function first. Power comes later. The biggest lie in language learning is that fluency comes from complexity. In reality, fluency comes from control. Control of pace. Control of energy. Control of meaning. That week, I stopped trying to prove my English. I started using it. And that's when English stopped feeling like a subject, and started feeling like a skill that belonged to me. Simple English didn't limit me. It gave me back my power. Brain science of saying no. At some point, I stopped thinking of no as a personality choice, and started seeing it as a neurological one. That shift changed how I understood English, stress, and why learning felt impossible on some days, and surprisingly easy on others. This was the week I realized my brain wasn't failing me. It was protecting me. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Your brain doesn't care if you want to improve your English. It cares if you feel safe. Every time you say yes when your body means no, your brain notices. It might not react immediately, but it logs the event. It remembers the tension, the confusion, the overload. And slowly, it starts associating English with danger, not physical danger, but social and emotional threat. Neuroscience has a name for this. Threat-based learning inhibition. When the brain senses threat, the amygdala becomes more active. That part of the brain doesn't learn languages. It prepares you to fight, flee, or freeze. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for comprehension, reasoning, and language, gets less blood flow. So when you feel stuck in English, forgetting words you already know, unable to focus while listening, it's often not a skill problem. It's a stress chemistry problem. I noticed this pattern clearly. On days when I protected my boundaries, when I said no, paused, or asked for clarity, my English flowed better. On days when I overcommitted, overexplained, or forced myself through conversations I wasn't ready for, my English collapsed by the evening. Same brain. Same vocabulary. Different nervous system state. That's when I started paying attention to how saying no changed my body. Not emotionally. Physically. When I said no calmly, my shoulders dropped. My breath slowed. My jaw unclenched. Those are signs of parasympathetic activation, the rest and digest mode. That mode is where learning happens. Memory forms there. Patterns stick there. Saying no wasn't blocking growth. It was creating the conditions for growth. There's research showing that perceived control reduces stress responses even in difficult environments. When your brain believes you have choice, cortisol drops. When cortisol drops, attention improves. And attention is the gateway to language acquisition. In simple terms, control helps you learn. English learners often feel out of control. Fast speech. Unclear rules. Cultural uncertainty. Accents. Expectations. Saying no is one of the few tools that restores control. Immediately. And it doesn't require advanced English. No, thank you. I can't right now. I need more information. These sentences do something powerful. They interrupt the stress cycle. They tell your brain, I am not trapped. And a brain that doesn't feel trapped becomes curious again. I started noticing how often native speakers used no to regulate their energy. Not emotionally. Practically. They declined invitations, rescheduled meetings, asked for clarification without apology. Their brains weren't overloaded because their boundaries filtered input. Meanwhile, learners, including me, often acted like open doors. Everything came in. Too much information. Too many expectations. Too little recovery time. That's not resilience. That's exhaustion. I also noticed something subtle. When I said no early, conversations became shorter. Cleaner. Less emotionally charged. My listening improved because there was less noise to process. My speaking improved because I wasn't rushing to please. Even my pronunciation felt steadier, not because it improved technically, but because my breathing stabilized. And breathing affects speech more than most people realize. From a brain perspective, language is embodied. It lives in your breath, your posture, your muscle tension. Stress tightens all of that. Saying no loosens it. That week, I stopped forcing long study sessions. I focused on short, regulated exposure. 10 minutes of listening when calm was worth more than an hour when stressed. I chose content that felt safe. Familiar voices. Predictable rhythm. Simple stories. My brain responded immediately. Words stuck. Patterns repeated themselves naturally. I wasn't memorizing, I was absorbing. If you're struggling with English, ask yourself something honestly. How often does English show up when you're already tired, rushed, or emotionally stretched? Learning in that state teaches your brain one thing. English equals stress. And your brain will resist it, no matter how motivated you are. But when you protect your limits, when you say no to overload, you teach your brain something else. English is manageable. English is safe. That belief changes everything. This isn't about becoming rigid or selfish. It's about respecting how your brain actually works. Motivation without regulation burns out. Discipline without boundaries collapses. Saying no is not the end of communication. It's the beginning of healthy communication. The kind your brain can actually learn from. That week, English stopped fighting my nervous system. Because for the first time, my nervous system felt like it had a voice. When progress feels invisible, there's a quiet phase in language learning that almost breaks you, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is visible. This was the week I learned the hardest truth about English. Real progress often looks like stagnation. On the outside, nothing had changed. I still paused mid-sentence. I still missed words in fast conversations. I still felt slow when responding. If you measured my English by speed or complexity, you would have said I was stuck. But inside, something was different. My reactions were slower, but calmer. My mistakes didn't trigger panic. My listening didn't collapse when I missed a phrase. I could stay present longer, even when I didn't fully understand. And that presence, I later learned, was the real signal of growth. Most learners track progress through visible markers, new vocabulary, faster speech, longer sentences. Those feel motivating because they are obvious. But they are also misleading. Because language acquisition doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in layers. First, your brain learns to survive. Then it learns to stabilize. Only later does it expand. That middle stage, stabilization, is brutal for motivation. You're no longer a beginner, so you don't get beginner wins. But you're not advanced enough to feel fluent. You exist in the in-between, where effort stays high and rewards feel delayed. This is where most people quit. I almost did. What saved me was noticing a different metric, recovery time. When something went wrong, when I misunderstood a question, or couldn't find a word, I recovered faster. I didn't spiral. I didn't shut down. I stayed in the conversation. Sometimes silently. Sometimes with simple English. But I stayed. That matters more than speed. From a learning science perspective, this phase is when neural networks are reorganizing. Old patterns are weakening. New ones aren't fully stable yet. The brain feels uncertain, so performance looks worse even though learning is happening underneath. This is called the restructuring phase. And it's uncomfortable by design. Think of it like renovating a house while still living in it. Things look messy. Some rooms are unusable. But progress is happening behind the walls. If you stop now, you're left with chaos. If you stay, you eventually get something stronger than before. I realized I had been mislabeling discomfort as failure. Discomfort wasn't a sign I was bad at English. It was a sign my brain was rewiring. So I changed how I practiced. I stopped chasing better English and focused on stabler English. I repeated the same listening materials, not to understand more words, but to feel more grounded. While listening, I spoke less, but more intentionally. I allowed silence instead of filling space with panic. And something strange happened. People started responding differently. They waited. They clarified. They met me halfway. Not because my English improved dramatically, but because my energy changed. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't apologizing for existing in the conversation. That shift made communication smoother, even with imperfect language. This taught me a painful lesson. Sometimes you don't need more English. You need less self-pressure. Pressure creates urgency. Urgency tells the brain there's danger. Danger shuts down learning. It's a vicious loop. Breaking that loop requires trust. Trust that invisible progress still counts. I also noticed how social media distorted my expectations. Short clips of fluency hacks. Before and after transformations. None of them showed the invisible middle. The boring repetition. The quiet weeks. The emotional regulation. Work. No one posts that. But that's where real fluency is built. Fluency isn't just speaking well. It's staying regulated while speaking imperfectly. It's listening without collapsing when you don't understand. It's trusting yourself enough to pause. That week, I stopped asking, am I improving? I started asking, am I more stable than last month? And the answer was yes. I could sit in English longer. I could handle confusion without panic. I could say, I don't know, without shame. Those aren't flashy skills. They are foundational ones. If you're in this phase right now, where English feels heavy, progress feels invisible, and motivation is fading, don't rush to change methods. Don't assume you're doing something wrong. First, check this. Are you still showing up? Are you still listening, even when it's hard? Are you still practicing without burning out? If yes, you're not stuck. You're integrating. Integration feels slow because it's quiet. But once it's done, everything speeds up naturally. Words come easier. Listening sharpens. Confidence appears without effort. You don't force your way out of this phase. You stay your way out. That week taught me patience, not the motivational kind, but the neurological kind. The kind that respects how long it takes for a brain to feel safe in a new language. English didn't suddenly click. But it stopped pushing me away. And sometimes, that's the biggest progress of all. Learning to protect yourself without guilt. There is a strange moment in language learning when English stops being just a tool and starts becoming a mirror. That week in America, English showed me something uncomfortable about myself. How easily I said yes, even when I meant no. Not because I wanted to be kind. Not because I agreed. But because I was afraid of sounding rude, afraid of misunderstanding, afraid of not being liked. If you're learning English, you know this fear well. You hesitate. You nod. You smile. You agree before your brain finishes translating your own feelings. And by the time you realize you didn't want to say yes, the moment is already gone. This was especially true in American culture, where being polite often looks different from What you're used to. People speak directly. They expect clarity. And silence is not automatically interpreted as respect. In my culture, saying no softly, or not saying it at all, can be a form of politeness. In America, that same behavior can be misunderstood as agreement. That difference cost me energy, time, and emotional safety. One small example, a neighbor kept asking for favors. Nothing dramatic. Just quick things. Watching their dog. Helping move boxes. Staying longer than I planned. Every time, I said yes automatically. My English brain was slower than my politeness. Reflex. Inside, I felt resentment building. Outside, I smiled. That gap between what you feel and what you say is dangerous. Not just socially, but psychologically. Research in emotional regulation shows that repeatedly suppressing boundaries increases stress hormones and reduces cognitive flexibility. In simple terms, the more you ignore your own limits, the harder it becomes to think clearly, especially in a second language. No wonder English felt exhausting. One evening, after another unnecessary yes, I sat alone and replayed the conversation in my head. Not the vocabulary, the moment. I realized something painful. I wasn't struggling with English. I was struggling with permission. Permission to pause. Permission to disappoint. Permission to protect myself. So I practiced something radical, but simple. I practiced saying no. Slowly. Clearly. Without explanations. Not sorry, I'm busy because. Not maybe another time. Just, I can't. In English. At first, it felt wrong. My body reacted before my mind. My chest tightened. My brain searched for justification. This is a known response. Neuroscience calls it a threat response. You're nervous. System interpreting boundary setting as social danger. But here's the twist. The danger wasn't real anymore. It was inherited from old environments, old rules, old power dynamics. America didn't punish me for saying no. People adjusted. Some were surprised. Some said, okay. Some disappeared, and that told me everything I needed to know. Each time I said no, something interesting happened to my English. My sentences became shorter. My voice steadier. My listening clearer. Because I wasn't overloaded with emotional noise. Language flows better when your nervous system feels safe. This is rarely talked about in language learning content. We focus on pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary. But boundaries, emotional clarity, those are invisible skills, and they directly affect fluency. When you don't feel allowed to say no, every conversation becomes a performance. You're acting instead of communicating. Acting consumes mental resources. Communication releases them. That week, I noticed I needed fewer words to express myself. Not because my English improved suddenly, but because I stopped over-explaining. Over-explaining is a fear response. It's your brain trying to earn safety through language. Once you remove that pressure, English becomes lighter. I also noticed how this shift affected my personal relationships. With my partner, with friends. With family. Clearer boundaries created calmer conversations. Fewer misunderstandings. Less resentment. Love didn't disappear when I said no. Respect appeared. And respect, I learned, is a two-way language. If you're learning English and feel constantly tired, ask yourself this. How many unnecessary yeses are you carrying? How many conversations are draining you, not because of English, but because you're betraying yourself in another language? You don't need advanced grammar to protect yourself. You need a few grounded sentences, practiced until they feel boring. I'm not comfortable with that. I need time to think. I can't commit to this. Say them slowly. Let the silence exist. Silence is not failure. Silence is space. From a psychological perspective, boundary setting strengthens your sense of agency. Agency reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety improves working memory. And working memory is essential for language processing. So yes, learning to say no literally makes your English better. Not louder. Not faster. Better. That week in America, English stopped being a test I had to pass. It became a tool I could use to protect my time, my energy, my relationships. I didn't become rude. I became clear. And clarity is kindness, with a backbone. If there's one thing I want you to remember from this part of the story, it's this: fluency without boundaries is just compliance in a foreign language. Real fluency includes the courage to choose yourself, calmly, clearly, without guilt. English didn't teach me how to say no. It taught me that I was allowed to. Saying no changed my life, quietly. If you expected a dramatic ending, perfect English, total confidence, a big victory speech, this isn't it. The real ending was quieter. Almost boring. And that's exactly why it mattered. In the final week of those 4 weeks in America, nothing extraordinary happened. No breakthrough conversation. No emotional confrontation. No moment where English suddenly felt easy. What happened instead was subtle. My life felt lighter. Not because I had mastered English, but because English stopped controlling me. I noticed it one morning while checking my calendar. Fewer commitments. More white space. Time that belonged to me. I hadn't planned this intentionally. It was the natural result of something simple. I had stopped agreeing automatically. Saying no didn't make my world smaller. It made it more honest. And honesty changes how you show up in a language. Before, every English conversation felt like a performance. My brain was busy predicting reactions, avoiding awkwardness, smoothing emotions. That mental noise made listening harder and speaking clumsier. English felt heavy because I was carrying too much emotional weight. Now, conversations felt cleaner. Not easier, but cleaner. I listened without rehearsing responses. I spoke without explaining myself into exhaustion. I allowed pauses. Without panic. This wasn't confidence. It was alignment. From a psychological standpoint, alignment reduces cognitive load. When what you feel, think, and say are consistent, your brain doesn't waste energy managing internal conflict. That freed up energy went straight into language processing. My English didn't become perfect, but it became usable. That's the kind of progress most people miss, because it doesn't look impressive from the outside. No one applauds when you feel calmer. No algorithm rewards emotional regulation. But this is where sustainable fluency lives. I also saw how this affected my family life. Clearer boundaries created more patience, less resentment, more presence. When I wasn't drained by unnecessary interactions, I had more energy for the people who mattered. Love felt simpler. Not easier, but simpler. And simplicity helps language learners more than complexity ever will. I started reflecting on why so many learners quit around this stage. It's not because English is too hard. It's because learning English forces you to confront parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood. A new language exposes your coping mechanisms. If your coping mechanism is people-pleasing, English will exhaust you. If it's perfectionism, English will humiliate you. If it's avoidance, English will stall you. But if you're willing to observe these patterns, without judging them, English becomes a teacher, not a threat. That's what changed for me. English stopped being something I needed to conquer. It became something I could coexist with. I didn't rush practice anymore. I chose consistency over intensity. 10 minutes of calm listening instead of an hour of stressed repetition. Slow speaking instead of fast guessing. Familiar stories instead of endless new material. This approach aligns with what neuroscience calls low arousal learning. The brain learns best when alert but safe. Not excited. Not stressed. Just steady. That steadiness is what carried me forward. And here's the part most people don't want to hear. Motivation didn't suddenly return. Discipline didn't become fun. Learning English didn't turn magical. What changed was my relationship with discomfort. I stopped treating discomfort as a sign to quit. I treated it as information. Some days, English still felt heavy. On those days, I did less, not more. I protected my energy. I trusted that rest was part of learning, not the enemy of it. That trust is what made progress stick. If you're watching this video and wondering whether you'll ever feel confident in English, I won't promise that you will. Confidence is unpredictable. But I can promise something more reliable. Clarity. Clarity about what you can handle. Clarity about what you need. Clarity about when to say yes and when to say no. That clarity will make your English stronger than confidence ever could. Because confidence can disappear under pressure. Clarity stays. So here's how this story really ends. I didn't become fluent in 4 weeks. I didn't solve every cultural misunderstanding. I didn't stop making mistakes. But I stopped abandoning myself in another language. And once that stopped, English stopped feeling like an enemy. It became a space I could grow into, slowly. Imperfectly, safely. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Learning English isn't just about adding words to your vocabulary. It's about removing the fear that doesn't belong to you anymore. Say no when you need to. Pause when you're unsure. Choose clarity over approval. Your English will follow. And one day, without noticing when it happened, you'll realize you're no longer trying to survive conversations. You're simply living in them. Before you click away, let me ask you one quiet question. What if the real reason English feels hard is not your vocabulary, not your grammar, but the fact that you've been afraid to protect yourself in another language? Most people think fluency is about speaking more. But what if it's actually about speaking less and meaning it? In America, I didn't just learn new words. I learned when to pause, when to breathe, when to say no without guilt. And that single skill changed how English felt in my mouth. Lighter, calmer, more real. If this story sounds uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. And this channel is built for exactly you. Here, we don't chase fast English. We practice real English. Slow, clear, emotional, and usable in real life. Through true stories, daily life in America. Love, marriage, family, culture shock. And the invisible struggles no textbook teaches you. If you want to train your listening, reading, and speaking naturally, while also rebuilding confidence from the inside out, this channel will feel like a safe place to stay. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story. Like the video if this helped you feel understood. Comment below, what's the hardest word for you to say in English, yes or no? The next video will go deeper into love, boundaries, and the quiet moments where English stops being a test and starts becoming your voice. Stay with me. Your English journey is just getting honest.